welcome everyone. Thanks for showing up in the two-dimensional world yet again, late at night or early in the evening. My name is Lisa Ryers. I'm class of 1990, and I'm one of the co-presidents of the Brown Club of Greater San Francisco. Welcome to one of our final events of the year. We've really been trying to keep up with our mission of alumni engagement even throughout this COVID period. We're averaging about 4 events online. Anyway, and we have our monthly book club every month with a wonderful alumni author like we have tonight. And we also thought that tonight, just to kind of round out the year, it would be really fun not only to have the author, but to have friends in the community on the topic that the author is writing about. And so we're really, really fortunate to have with us some also fellow alums to talk with Julia about her book. So just to introduce our panelists for tonight, Julia Flynn Siler is a New York Times bestselling author and journalist. Her most recent book, The White Devil's Daughters, The Women Who Fought Slavery in San Francisco Chinatown, was a New York Times editor's choice and a finalist for the California Book Award. Tonight, she'll be discussing her book, Lost Kingdom, Hawaii's Last Queen, the Sugar Kings, and Hawaii, America's First Imperial Adventure, which explains why the independent kingdom of Hawaii became the 50th state. A veteran journalist, Siler was a foreign correspondent based in London and has been a guest commentator on PBS, the BBC, CNBC, and CNN. She lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with her husband and their 2 sons. She is a member of the class of '82, where she concentrated in American studies. She'll be in conversation with John Toupin, class of '85, whose mother, Elizabeth Ahn Toupin, was born in Honolulu in 1925. She witnessed the attack of Pearl Harbor as a 16-year-old exactly on December 7th, 1941. Elizabeth wrote the Hawaii Cookbook. John, you can hold up the book again. In 1964, and it became a bestseller and paid for John's tuition for Brown. He also went to Capitol Hill and interned for Senator Daniel Inouye, a Democrat from Hawaii, a childhood classmate of his mother when he was a young man. Finally, we're also delighted to also welcome Sara To, a member of the Brown class of 2003 and also a Punahou grad. Soon to be a mother of 4, Sara is teaching her children about the Queen's legacy, including her commitment to social justice. So, with that, I'm going to pass it off to John to be our moderator for tonight, and welcome everyone.
Thank you, Lisa.
So nice to meet everyone. So Julia, let's start with some Brown questions.
Okay.
I understand you were born and raised. You were born and raised in Palo Alto, is that right?
Well, I was born in Palo Alto. I was raised most of the time in Marin County, and that's where we live now.
Okay. So how did you find your way to Providence? That was a long, long way away.
Well, it's not as great of an origin story as yours, John, with the Hawaii Cookbook. But, you know, I think that around the time I was applying for college in 1978, Brown was making a big push to find kids in California who wanted to come east. And there were a whole bunch of us from my high school and from our area who ended up going to Brown. And I still see them all the time. So that's how I ended up. But that said, it was a complete culture shock to land in Providence. I had never lived on the East Coast. I was not at all prepared, and ended up loving it. But that first year was a little, you know, bumpy, I would say.
Okay. And then you concentrated in AmCiv, is that correct?
That's correct. Now we call it American Studies, but yeah.
American Studies, okay.
Yeah.
And did you do a lot of writing in that? Or, I mean, you ended up having a career as a writer, so was that where it started, or?
Yeah, you know, my senior year, I ended up taking a class that really changed the direction of my life. And it was this magazine class. And in fact, there was a kid from San Francisco who's now a really well-known journalist. You guys probably know him, Peter Waldman, who was the star of our magazine writing class. But Dana Cowan was in it as well, who became the editor of Food and Wine, and a whole bunch of interesting people and motivated people. And I just fell in love with journalism at that point. And I'd done a little bit of Brown before. I had helped start this little, alternative newspaper called The Rake. I wrote for Issues magazine. But it really wasn't until that magazine class, my senior year, that things, seemed to click. And AmCiv was really a basket kind of concentration where I could throw everything I had done over the last 4 years. But I ended up doing my thesis as an oral history project of Rhode Island mill workers, which, is kind of eerie to the degree to which it foreshadowed the work I would do now. And women's history, interviewing people. I really started at Brown, and I'm really grateful for the experience that I had there and the opportunity to try out different things. So thanks for asking, Joe.
All right. So then, reading your bio, you ended up picked up a couple of extra degrees and lived all through Europe. Yeah. Prague, London.
Prague and London. Yeah.
Okay. Those are not near Hawaii. How did you come across the topic of, the annexation of Hawaii and the Last Kingdom?
Well, I really think that there's truth in the idea of a zeitgeist moment. And the young junior senator from Illinois had just been elected president. Of course, he'd gone to Punahou and been raised in Hawaii. All of a sudden, the attention started focusing there, and I became interested in it. And I should go backwards a little bit, which is that in my home, my parents had a weekly singing group, and they brought together singers every Wednesday night. And it was, real 70s kind of thing. A lot of wine was drunk and lots of merriment. But one of the outstanding singers who came to our home every week was a woman named Luana McKinney, who is a revered Native Hawaiian singer to this day. And so we got to know the McKinney family a little bit. So I was, I knew a little bit about Hawaii, and we had traveled there as a family, but it really was President Obama's election that drew me to the subject. And I do have a funny story around that. I was not the only one, of course, who suddenly thought, let's write about Hawaiian history. Because one day in the state archives in Hawaii, which is in downtown Honolulu, right across from the state legislative building, I walk in, and one of my habits is always to look at who signed in ahead of me, because I was curious, what other scholars are there. And this is an archive. There's usually not that many people in this place. I walk in, and there is a very famous name, Sara Vowell. And my heart leapt into my throat. It's like, why is Sara Vowell here? Well, I walked up to her, introduced myself. She was wearing all black and could not have been more gracious or nicer. And it has that squeaky voice that many people know from National Public Radio. She wrote a very similar book to mine and got it out faster, called Unfamiliar Fishes. So she had a very, very similar idea to the one I had for Lost Kingdom.
Interesting. Part of my backstory is I read, so forgive me, but I grew up with her name in my house. She was Queen Lil, which I gather is more of a westernization. You probably wouldn't do that today, but that's how I knew her, as Queen Lil. I think I said in my bio that my AP history text in 1980 had all of about 4 sentences on the annexation of Hawaii. And even as an 18-year-old, it intrigued me. And I ended up writing a term paper on it. I read her diary, which was about the only source I could lay my hands on at the time. And so this is actually a story that I've known for a long, long time, but no one else I've ever met has ever heard of this story or cared.
John, did you go to the archives as a high schooler to do that?
I actually wrote to my godfather, the senator, and he sent me a copy of the diary. And then I went through various local, I grew up on the Tufts University campus. I went through the Tufts library trying to hunt down things. But it was really sparse. And so, I mean, I just got the feeling that no one really cared other than the fact that we own this place. And, you know, the next stop was 1941. And as far as US history was concerned, nothing else really ever happened there. And so that intrigued me. And so all these years later to find, you know, not one, but I guess 2 or 3 books on the subject is absolutely fascinating to me.
Well, John, just to follow up, I went back to my son. My son was in high school at the time I was working on this book. And I went back to his middle school textbook to see how it described the annexation of Hawaii. And there was literally one sentence.
Interesting is I haven't made pies in a long time, but I mean, it all came back. It's exactly. The other thing I don't remember now is my mom taught me how to make pie.
Can we just have everyone mute themselves, please? If they could do that, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, and so the Obama sparked your interest, but what about the actual story of the Queen? Was that something that you had known about at all, or is that just part of the discovery process for you?
I'd known about it a little bit. Around that same time, there was a lot of thought going into the notion of American expansionism. So there were historians exploring that idea around the same time as I was working on this. But, you know, it quickly became clear to me that, you know, rather than the bigger picture of American expansionism, and specifically the sugar kings, as I label them, that the most compelling character was Queen Liliuokalani, and also the greatest amount of primary material to work with. Because one of the great kind of surprises in this process was also in that archives being introduced to a scholar who essentially gifted me with 4 years of work that he had done transcribing meticulously letters amongst the royal family, and no other scholar had done that. In fact, he has just published the Queen's Diaries this year, which is an amazing piece of work. But we became friends, and he was really gracious and shared this with me. So that's kind of changed the focus of my book. You know, rather than a sweeping book about American expansionism, it really focused more on Queen Liliuokalani and her story.
So I believe that you got access to drafts of her diary, and you pointed out some of the differences and some of the, you know, referred to at least some of the stories about, like, was it her editor? Was it her? You know, what's your thought on that, having actually been able to read the changes?
Her editor was very deeply involved in the shaping of that manuscript, and it really was fascinating to follow the edits through the different manuscript copies that were in the state archives. That said, and you know, particularly to look at what had been cut out, because she used much more fiery language than ultimately ended up in the book. And the book had her book had a very specific intention, and that was to try to block the annexation of the Hawaiian kingdom and to restore the monarchy, which she was not able to do. So
do you think her original voice would have been better off achieving her political ends, or did it need to actually be toned down even further?
I don't think it really made much difference one way or the other, in that there were so many other things going on around the annexation of Hawaii that it was almost, how how would I say it? It was very unlikely that her particular actions or the people who signed the petitions, the thousands of people who signed, Native Hawaiians who signed petitions to try to block the annexation, it didn't make very much difference because the US was gearing up towards war. The Spanish-American War broke out. It was coming out of a financial panic of 1893. There was a presidential change. The presidential politics were extremely complex at that point. There was too much going on. And in a geopolitical way, Hawaii was almost too valuable as an asset in the Pacific to the great powers of that time.
So I think one of the things that I learned reading this book was that the idea of annexing Hawaii was maybe 30 years old at that point. It had sort of ebbed and flowed to the US government over the decades. It seems to have always been a controversial subject. And I think it's, the story I was saying is that we were in Kauai last summer on July 4th, and there was a local on the beach who was like, I'm not celebrating this. You shouldn't celebrate this. July 4th is, marks the illegal occupation of my homeland. And he was educating anyone who wanted to engage with him on the history of it. And so I think that right now there's a resurgence in independent Hawaii movement. Mm-hmm. I assume that there was around the turn of the 20th century. Did that just go away and then come back recently, or has it always been there in the background?
Well, I would make the point that in the early 20th century, there was active suppression of not only the culture of Hawaii, but also political activism on the part of Native Hawaiians. I think it really came back in the 70s and 80s. And that's when we started to see the University of Hawaii work to bring back Hawaiian language and the rise of kind of the Native Hawaiian Studies department there. But, I'd like to, John, would you mind? Let's ask Sara her thoughts, because she was raised on Oahu, and she might have some thoughts. Sara, you still there?
Yep, I'm still here. If my internet gets a little funky, just raise your hand or something. But I mean, you brought up a lot of points that made me reminisce on what it was like growing up in both the public school system, where we did learn, in addition to like the Pledge of Allegiance, we would have Hawaiiana. And it was nice to have that resurgence during my childhood there, because I felt like it was a culture, the language, the hula dancing, like it was put off to the side for a little bit, but growing up, it was something that was becoming perpetuated again. And so I grew up going to like a Native Hawaiian camp at Kamehameha called Explorations. So you spend a week like doing a deep dive into learning more about your Hawaiian culture. And then in high school, there's like another camp that Kamehameha hosts. And so it was just it's just a beautiful place to grow up. And my husband teases me and says, you grew up in this, like with rose colored glasses, and there's like a dark underbelly, I'm sure. But to be in a place where you feel this connection to not only the community that you live in, but the cultural aspects of it. And Julia, I was actually talking to David Forbes today, who worked on the diaries, who highly respects you and thinks so highly of you and enjoys the work that you do. But
David, I'm a huge fan of his.
Yes, and he's done so much research on it. And it was just a nice reminder to hear that Liliuokalani was, he mentioned that she was a thinker. Like, yes, the cultural aspects of it are really important, but I think what gets lost in modern day society today is kind of the work that has gone behind so much in the islands. Like, we think as a tourist, like the flowers and all the nice things that come with being a visitor, but a lot of the heartache and the sadness that comes with it too. And so you had mentioned the independence, and if if people want like a sovereign nation, and there, I remember there was a very strong movement when I was living there as a child for a sovereign nation. But then the practicality of being a part of the United States is just something that's so much more practical for the people who are living there. But the way that I connect my childhood and my ancestry with my children, because I homeschool them, is just learning about like the Queen's Prayer, teaching them Hawaiian, and like learning about holidays that I never knew about growing up. Like there's in November, there's a day called La Ku'oko'a, which is it's the celebration of independence of Hawaii, the Hawaiian Kingdom. Like growing up, I didn't really learn about that. So I think going back into history when you have children is a really nice way to keep those ties. So I'm trying to give them just hobbies and their beaches and their nice things about growing up in the whole, but there's a lot of sadness too. I appreciated that. Things that are named after these missionary families. There's a lot of controversy behind it too. They donated a lot of money, but you don't hear about these stories as much in school because they're funding a lot of these school systems or the remnants of the past that are like marks of these people. So it was nice to hear that when I was reading your book. And I did have a question for you, and it was just, how did your perspective of Liliuokalani change after you wrote this book? Like going in, you probably had a perspective going into it, which drew you into it, but how did that change after all of your research?
That's a great question. I mean, I spent about 4 years writing and researching this book, and I felt tremendous sadness, and even more so towards the end of it. And you know, so much of the research involved my head and reading and going through documents. But what really touched my heart was when I was invited to in the Queen's Church to sing her hymns. There's a special day once a year where her songs are performed by the choir, the same choir that she directed for so many years, for decades, after the point when she was overthrown and until her death, pretty much. And that's when I was most touched by the experience. To kind of, I think she communicated very much through her music, and that's when I felt her the most. But I felt great sadness. That, to answer your question, Sarah.
Yeah. I got a sense of that in some of the pieces that you wrote in the chapters, just the sadness. I feel like my internet's a little shaky, so I'm gonna go on mute.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah, so much for sharing your perspective. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
So I have kind of a little bit of an, take a step back. I noticed that you've also written about Richard Branson and the Mandavi family.
Yeah.
So are there parallels you wanted to draw between the Sugar Kings of Hawaii from 130 years ago and these sort of more modern, you know, dynastic wealth families?
Well, I mean, both enterprising, you know, Richard Branson is a marvelous, bigger than life character. And I wish that I could have met some of the 19th century characters who were changing the face of Hawaii. I imagine they were, some of them at least, were bigger than life as well. Certainly there were bigger than life scoundrels in Hawaii at that time.
Sure.
And, but, you know, I think that it's, after I wrote the book about the Mandavis, which was based primarily on my interviewing of people, I decided history is what I should focus on. And, you know, I don't know, and now I'm veering back, and I think there's really nothing that can be as good as talking to someone directly and spending time with them. And one of the great surprises and joys of my life as a journalist was flying on a jumbo jet with Richard Branson, just the two of us. And his new Virgin Airways was starting a new route from London to the Caribbean or some of the Caribbean islands. And he wanted to check out one of the islands that had just experienced I think it was an earthquake. And so the two of us flew there and then flew back. And it was really quite an amazing experience. I mean, imagine if you could do that with those same 19th century entrepreneurs and ask them questions in kind of a darkened cabin where it's just the two of you. So wow. I don't know if I answered your question, John, but there you go.
Well, I mean, actually, the one I forgot was Larry Ellison, because didn't he buy Lanai?
He did buy Lanai. Yeah, I've never interviewed him. Yeah, I've been to Lanai. I'm sure most of you have. But
he's more of the scoundrel, I think. I think he would fit more, nicely into the Sugar King mentality. I guess that sort of goes through most of my list. I guess one other sort of historical question for you is, do you think the real driver of this was sugar, or was it Pearl Harbor? Or was it something else?
A military position in the Pacific, is that what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, the US government got pulled into all of this, and they didn't care enough to reverse it. So the question I have is, was it because of the economic interest of sugar, or was it really, did they have an eye on Pearl Harbor the whole time? Because that's ultimately what I think 50 years later, and since then it's been Pearl Harbor. But at the time, Pearl Harbor was just an unimproved, delta, right?
That's right.
It wasn't what it is today.
Yeah, it had the potential to be the most important port in the North Atlantic or North Pacific, which was, of course, is extraordinarily important. Well, can I answer by saying both were important?
Sure.
I think that both were important, and some of the interests coincided. So a number of the very influential sugar barons were also property owners around Pearl Harbor. It remains today a very tight community where business interests and military interests often coincide. So,
okay. Let me I'll wind up with one question. So, looking back at your Brown career, how come you didn't concentrate in history?
That's a good question. I wasn't really that good at history. I remember taking a class with Gordon Wood, who of course is revered, and getting a paper back, probably graded by one of the TAs, saying, "You really didn't understand this at all, did you?" So it could be also true today, but it's funny because I'm going back to Stanford as on a fellowship. It was supposed to be this fall, and I hope it'll be soon. But my whole point will be to study history and study American history when I'm there. So I want a do-over, John. And you got your finger right on my sore point. I should have studied history probably.
All right.
I love it. I read history voraciously. So.
As do I. Of course, I'm a computer science guy, so this is all completely out of my realm.
But I never really got the answer when you were growing up. What was your favorite recipe? Did you make it tonight, or was there something else from your mom's cookbook that you loved?
What would be the kalbi?
Yeah, it's probably kalbi.
Yeah, well, this is the barbecued Korean beef. Nice. And so John went and picked up the special cut of meat that you use, and you marinate it and grill it, and it's been a fit. So the famous story is my sister-in-law was a vegetarian, and when she was pregnant, she started craving meat, and John converted her back to being an omnivore with the Korean beef.
Hey, Sara, if you're still there.
Yeah, I'm here.
Do you have any good food memories? You were just in the islands.
Oh, yes. It's funny you asked because my mom is a cooking teacher. She was a cooking teacher at Punahou. And now, so I had her for 3 years as my home ec teacher. But she's actually a part of this this organization called Kokua Foundation, which Jack Johnson, the singer, helps to run. And so we do a lot of cooking when I go home. Right now, she's really on a ulu kick, which is breadfruit. Oh, yeah. So it's like 50 ways to make ulu. We do ulu fried rice. We made a ulu pound cake when we were home. My sister and brother both pound pa'iai, which is like the waterless pounded kalo or taro. And so she's gotten all kinds of fellowships through Julia Child's foundation. And like she's gotten Fulbrights to go to learn about cooking in Spain and Morocco and Japan. So when I think about like my kids growing up, I feel like she got a second win when we left for college when I went to Brown. So I think there's hope. Like sometimes like, why? I'm homeschooling. I feel like I'm giving. But I feel like I'm also learning through my children, and we cook a lot together. But my favorite recipes, I think, are, gosh, my husband loves any type of plate lunch. So I feel like growing up with Filipino food and Hawaiian food, I love Hawaiian food. Like I think it looks terrible. It's so not aesthetically pleasing in a lot of ways. But I love that, and I love lau. And every New Year's we would make lau with my grandmother, which is the wrapped up taro with fish and the roots of the taro leaves. And it was just a really nice way to bring the family together. So I just love how food is so universal and that you can learn about cultures through it.
That is so awesome. And I'd love to talk to your mom. I did a front page story for the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago about red food, about ulu, and it caused controversy. So I focused on Hawaii's efforts to become sustainable in terms of food production, because food supply there is something like 3 days if something happens. And
oh my gosh,
scientists are thinking the best thing to do is to focus on breadfruit.
It's so versatile.
Blue Festival, which was absolutely fabulous, and so that's.
I wish I could find an alternative in California, but I guess there's sweet potato, but it's not quite the same. But that's fascinating that you have gone into a deep dive with that. I'll tell her about that.
I met so many amazing people in Hawaii over the years. I would also say there's a professor at the University of Hawaii, is now emeritus. His name is Puakea Nogelmeyer. I wrote a page one story for him about in the Wall Street Journal as well. And he's the guy who's leading this project to translate 19th century Native Hawaiian newspapers. And he is just such an incredible person, and just so many interesting people. So.
Has he published anything that we can read at the moment, or is he still in the works with what he's doing?
Oh gosh, he's got a really good website, and you can click on the translations that he and many of his grad students have done over the last decade or two. But he's published a lot as well. He's extremely well regarded, and he's often the go-to person when there's a need for a translation from 19th century Native Hawaiian into contemporary English. And not only that, there's another great thing. Anybody who's ridden bus system in Honolulu will have heard his voice, because that's Puakea Nogelmeyer who's saying,
oh my gosh,
oh wow, for Kalakaua Avenue. Yeah.
That's so funny. I know that voice.
Isn't that a great voice?
Yes. And my husband always says, it shouldn't be called the bus. Why is it the bus? It should be the bus. Julia, I did have a question. How did you keep track of all the things that you would research? Because when you're pulling from so many different resources, what's your organization tactic with all that? Because that was when I took history at Brown, I was so overwhelmed by all of the various sources that I never knew really which pathway to like a plan of attack. So when you're having all of these resources in your life, what is your approach? And I know this is a short call, but like just high level as I teach my kids and as they learn about history. Absolutely. How do you organize?
Well, first of all, I would say that this holds true for kids in 4th grade and people who are writing narrative histories like I do. chronology is your friend. And usually the first thing I do is set out a very detailed timeline. And then I'll break it out by character and who intersects where along the, we're moving through time. People are coming in and out of the story. So you can see it that way. Now, I also had the good fortune to work with an absolutely brilliant researcher for all three books, who, and in the case of Lost Kingdom, we created a website. It sounds old-fashioned now, but it wasn't then, a website for ourselves. And we had essentially searchable digital scans of all of our primary materials, or many of our primary materials. And so David Forbes, when he generously gifted us all those transcriptions, those would go on to that website. And but the key thing was to create the backbone of a chronology of where the story is going to start and where it's going to end. Does that answer your question, Sara?
It does. And he had mentioned that some of the diary entries he had were like half sentences. So I'm not sure if you had to deal with that too, which is really challenging on top of writing a book, is navigating how to finish those thoughts or think about what she was actually trying to mean.
Well, again, it was super helpful, not only to be in close touch with David, but to have my researcher, Catherine Thorpe, because there were parts where the Queen would write something in her diaries and it could be read many different ways. And so by having a second set of eyes, I could kind of check with her and say, do you think this interpretation is in the ballpark? And so we would have discussions about a lot of that, because there are so many ways to look at what the Queen wrote in her diaries. So thanks for asking that question, Sara.
Well, yeah, I was scared of history in school, to be honest. And now that I'm teaching my kids a little bit about it, I'm trying to use the lens of learning about people's character traits and what decisions they made, and having that personal connection, which is what I felt like I was sort of missing in my upbringing. So that's why I enjoyed seeing more of her characteristics and like trying to focus on, wow, what would my decision have been in that situation? Let alone being a female, but it's a more of a matriarchal society, like during that time. At least that's what I was raised getting to know, is that women had were revered a little bit, esteemed more, but it was just really interesting to see it from that lens when I read this book. Whereas in high school, it's like, history, there's so much in there. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but I think I appreciate it more now.
Yeah, me too. So I wonder, does anybody else have any questions? I'd love to, or comments, or any other experiences in Hawaii, any favorite food, anything you're missing?
I can chime in. I am coming to you from Maui right now, so excited to be here. I'm giving you the Maui sunset in the background. Something that I found really stark is the difference between how much access I have on Maui to the culture and history of Hawaii versus on Honolulu. There's just this enormous drop off in terms of how to interact with the culture and just even find out basic information. And it makes me want to go back to Honolulu. We were just on Oahu for the first time a couple weeks ago, but it's very stark. And I'm curious if anyone on the call has any favorite books or ways to sort of ramp up on Hawaiian history.
Well, I have a couple suggestions. David Forbes' name has come up a bit. I would try to, one of the problems on Maui and the smaller islands is that there are very few bookstores anymore, and the libraries, I imagine, are closed because of the pandemic. I could be wrong about that, but
everything's open here.
Everything's open?
Yeah.
Yeah. A relatively low infection rate.
Oh, you're making me so jealous. We've just had a shutdown in the Bay Area, as you probably
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Well, I have one daughter in New Zealand right now. They have 0 in the whole country.
Wow. Well, David Forbes' new book about the Queen's Diaries is a wonderful, wonderful book to try to track down. It's absolutely stunningly beautiful. It's designed by Barbara Pope Book Designs, who is a well-known designer on Oahu. The visually, it's stunning. So I would try to track down that book if you have a chance. And you know, there's right now, since yesterday was the anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack, there are a lot of good books about what happened during Pearl Harbor. So you could try that. One is by my friend, a book called Target Tokyo, which is a spectacular narrative history of that. So just a few suggestions.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
And since you're on Maui, I'm guessing you don't really come to Oahu very much, Greg?
I went there with my family just before Thanksgiving for a couple of weeks.
Okay. Because there's a book by Denby Fawcett, who's she's a journalist in the islands, and she wrote a book called Secrets of Diamond Head: A History and Trail. And I think it's also a nice way to kind of get history for that island and parts of other islands too. But I really liked that book too.
Could you tell me that again or put it in chat?
Sure, I'll do that.
Thank you, Sarah.
Oh, somebody's suggesting James Michener's book, Hawaii, which apparently, Sarah, tell me if this is true, people are still mad at Michener over that book in the islands.
That's my experience. I haven't read it, to be honest. I think I've had segments read I've done segments for school, but I haven't read the entire book. But yeah, I think a lot of things are controversial no matter what. No one's going to always be happy, but I think it's important that it gets it out. And even if it's controversial, I feel like the discussion that comes about brings a lot of truth to light. And so, yeah, I feel like no one can please everybody. I mean, I'm curious what kind of, if you faced any controversy with your book. I think that's really hard, especially coming as a person outside of the islands.
Yeah, I do think that there was resistance and kind of some animosity towards a mainlander coming and writing this book. Somebody told me a story early on, an academic at the University of Hawaii, and the story is about I think it's called Aloha Bird, which migrates from Alaska to the islands and then, you know, gorges itself on the fruits and all the best things that the islands have to offer, and then leaves at the end of a period of time. You probably know that sort of story, Sarah. And somebody said, you know, you need to be aware that people are going to look at you as essentially like that bird. But I think over time, people you know, I've gotten a lot of words of thanks for doing it too. And I've spoken to Hawaiian immersion school kids. I've spoken at the Kamehameha schools. I've spoken at Punahou. So I've been invited a number of places to try to give back to the community as well, and what I discovered in the archives. And that's important. So.
And I think especially with what happened in Hawaii's history of not trying to learn about Native Hawaiian history, I feel like people are kind of making the extra effort to learn a lot right now, kind of like to make up for lost time. At least like when you had mentioned your book and sharing it with me, I was like, I'm going to do my best because I'm on the mainland, and I feel like I'm robbing myself and my children this opportunity to learn about the culture that we don't have access to on an everyday basis. So it's like a race for time right now.
Yeah.
Well, and I also say I was motivated in part to do this book, not just by Obama's election, but also by the fact that so much of California's history and so many of the great fortunes of California's families are tied to what happened in Hawaii in the 19th century. And I was very curious about the Spreckles family. And most of you've probably driven over the Carquinez Bridge and seen the C&W old factory on your right as you're heading towards Sacramento, California. What is C&W? C&H, sorry, C&H, California and Hawaii Sugar Company. You know, to this day, descendants of the Spreckles family still own giant ranches in the Napa Valley area. There is a lot of wealth that ended up in California, but originally came from the islands. And so I was interested in that as well.
Yeah, it wasn't just sugar because a lot of them got into shipping as well.
Yes, well, Spreckles, of course, was the Oceanic Steamship Company.
Yeah.
Thank you, Richard, for pointing that out.
And Dollar was a big name in shipping as well.
Yeah, Robert Dollar was a local guy, so he owned the biggest steamship company between China and the West Coast, and San Francisco, of course, was the biggest port. And they, because of the nature of steamships in the 19th century, they had to stop to refuel in the islands, and that was part of the development of the tourism.
I didn't know that. Now, one part of the Hawaii story that's always fascinated me, just because I've met so many descendants, is the picture bride story, and you know how the original agricultural workers were brought to Hawaii, and what a productive group they turned out to be. Some of them moved from Hawaii to California and started the flower business. You couldn't cover everything, but that's a segment that I always found fascinating.
Yeah, there are some beautiful novelistic treatments of that experience.
Yes. Yeah.
As well. But thanks for bringing that up. Absolutely.
That's pretty much my family story.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. So I think my grandfather arrived about 10 years after this book wraps up, and started off in the fields and ended up with a carnation plantation and a store. And, you know, and then his kids went to college.
Yeah.
Classic American story. And my grandmother may or may not have been a picture bride. There's a certain amount of debate about all that, but that is all a different history, a very, very different history than the history of the Hawaiians in Hawaii. It was a chapter that really had almost no Hawaiians in it.
No, but they wound up being quite influential.
Oh, they own everything. They own everything. They run everything.
Yeah.
I don't know, Sarah, maybe you know, but when I was, at least when I was a kid, Hawaii was about 60% Japanese descendants. Is that still true?
I'm not sure on the numbers. Like, I feel like it's just really getting mixed up. I wouldn't want to quote anything, but I know that growing up at Punahou, years ago it was mostly haole, white, and now it's really, I feel like people have really taken a pride in being Native Hawaiian. Like, I feel like they recognize the culture more. The language is taught, and most of my classmates were mixed. So I'm Chinese Hawaiian, Native Hawaiian, Chinese, Native Hawaiian, German, Portuguese, and I feel like that was very representative. A lot of my classmates just being really mixed. And so when I got to Brown, there was do you guys remember the Third World Center?
Yes.
Yep.
And I was like, what is this? And what kind of name is this? And I didn't go because I was like, I don't know what it feels like to be a minority. So why would I go to a program like this? But in retrospect, I wish I did, so that I could learn about what people's experiences were growing up as a minority in their school.
It was unfortunately named, but there's tremendous loyalty to what they
totally.
did.
And I all my friends were a part of that program. And so it made me wish I had done it. And I really
ABCs from California would be invited.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. That's really funny. I felt so bad about not going that I ended up asking the coordinators to give me all of their slideshows, like their decks, so I could kind of go through what I had missed. And they were kind enough to pass it on. Because I started working at a boarding school in East Palo Alto here. And we were talking about race and how to navigate that when you're, because I taught at a school where everyone was either Latino, Hispanic, or Black, and that's how they chose the students for the boarding school. So navigating that when you're a minority going off to college is really a challenge. So like, I feel really lucky to have grown up in a place so diverse, but I also appreciate people who have to navigate that on their own when they go to college, because it was kind of new to me.
Is that East Side Prep?
Yes, it is. Yeah. So I lived in the dorms with, I was in the boys' dorm with my husband. So we lived there for 3 years. And you're basically like a pharmacy / tutor / teacher /
I might have bought you some bed sheets because I did contribute for about 6 years. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much.
It did a great job.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thanks for doing that. Yeah, I really miss that place. We live like 5 minutes away from that school, but it's a great school.
Yeah, it is really.
So Sarah, I think, it's interesting. You're about exactly halfway between me and my daughter, who's actually on this call also. My experience was very close to your experience. I'm half Korean and the other half is Norwegian, German, French, Canadian. I was definitely out of place in Boston growing up, but I felt at home whenever I was in Hawaii because everyone else was like that. But in terms of at Brown, the Third World Center had no appeal to me at all. I really didn't understand it, and I didn't seek it out, and it didn't offer a lot for my personal experience. That's what I felt like at the time. Chantal had a very different experience. It sounds like yours was closer to mine, but hers, I think they've come a long way, baby. I think if you look at the demographics at Brown, multi-biracial was not even a category until like 2003, maybe about the time you were there. They didn't even track it. And now they have it about 8% of the students self-identify as multiracial. And so it really is a thing that there was no formal recognition of it in my day, I will say. And maybe Chantal can give you an idea of what it's like now. I think there were 2 or 3 student groups specifically geared towards bi and multiracial kids. That's how prevalent it is.
Yeah, I think that was the first year they had a Hapa club too, which I thought was really funny. Do you know if the name's still Third World Center? Or is there a different term used?
No, they changed it.
What is it now?
I apologize. I don't remember what it's called now.
So now it's the Brown Center for Students of Color. The name was changed, but TWTP, Third World Transition Program, still exists.
That's amazing.
I was lucky enough to go through it when I was a first year, and then had a lot of friends who ended up coordinating, and I ran one seminar on white one year, but it's just wonderful. And it's the students, the coordinators. I ran the multiracial group for a few years. So Hapa Club has changed to MASH, which is Multi-Ethnic Asian Pacific Heritage Club.
Quite an acronym.
Yeah, lots of acronyms. I had, sorry to redirect, but I did have one question for Julie. I know that you're not a historian, so I studied computer science and history. History, I focused on Latin America. I focused a lot on like the transition between colonial and neo-colonial, basically, for a lot of Latin American countries, which most of the time marked a transition between like a combination of Spain, France, and England to US versions of colonialism and power, annexation, military control, economic control. So what's really interesting to me about Hawaii is that Hawaii kind of marks the beginning of the US's neocolonial reign. And it also is a unique situation where a lot of times the US would come in purely from a business perspective. Like you think of United Fruit Company, right? We're not actually annexing Colombia or Venezuela, wherever, but we are, definition neocolonialism, ruling through economic power and some military force, but it's all through private companies. But Hawaii is an example where there's a few places where we ended up either annexing or at least having like actual, it's a state now, but actual government involvement. And so I'm curious how you, like, if you read about other places that the US either was involved in or just similar sugar plantation places like Cuba, Haiti is a great example, and kind of sharing those histories of colonialism.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So the subtitle of the book refers to the importance of Hawaii in the history of American imperialism, if you'll put it that way, as being a very important marker of taking over what was then an independent constitutional monarchy. And so, yeah, I do explore that. And I decided to, shortly before my book was published, there was a very excellent book by the former New York Times reporter, Stephen Kinzer, I think, called Overthrow, which documented that long history that you're referring to. So I didn't want to retread what he had done, and I was more interested in what was going on in Hawaii specifically, focusing on the Queen. But that's why the story is so important, because it was such a marker in American history as well. And I've got to say, one of the really interesting experiences that I had over the last few months was being interviewed for a PBS American Experience documentary about the Queen. And they did such a spectacular job. And I think they'll be sharing this short film with schools in Hawaii, especially, to tell the story and situate it in the larger context of American history. So, but thanks, Chantal, for bringing that up. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, I think I had some questions. I had a question for John, just in terms of what your mother told you about that day at Pearl Harbor, what that was like. And then I also had a question for Julie, just in terms of, and probably for Sara too, what that you feel like the temperament or the vibe of Hawaii is in terms of its affinity, fealty towards dynastic culture. Like in Britain, there's obviously such an attraction to this day to the monarchy, to the crown, that popularity, and if there is any vestiges of that you noticed in Hawaii. So those were my two questions for the two of you.
I guess I'll go first. By the way, my mother loves your book. I sent it to her and she's read it. She's 95 and she's still an avid reader.
Thank you. I love hearing that.
So, her recollections of, and it's really just come out in the last, 10 years, she started telling more and more stories of it. So she was 16 years old, and, the sirens went off and the radio came on and said, everyone stay inside. So everyone ran outside to watch the bombing of the harbor from the hills, where they could see down and see what was going on. I think that the long-term effect wasn't the bombing, it was the immediate weeks afterwards, when they didn't really know whether the Japanese were going to invade Hawaii or not. And as a Korean family, they were especially worried for a Japanese invasion. Her parents had escaped or left Japan-occupied Korea. It was not a happy situation. She was in a family with 4 girls and a boy. It was pretty dark. And I think that was, she's never really talked about, but the absolute terror of not knowing about whether the invasion was coming or not was really, I think, more important than the actual day of the bombing. Sarah, you want to answer the other part?
Sure. I think there's just a lot of sadness. Like I remember growing up, going to visit the palace and hearing the story and just being overcome with a lot of, I guess, mourning. But I know that my life would have been completely different if we hadn't become a part of the United States. But when I talk to people about it, and like as a kid, I honestly didn't have like these conversations with my friends as much as I wish I did. I think it would have been really neat to grow up as a young adult living in Hawaii. My parents and my sister and brother still live there, and they still are very, very close to their Hawaiian roots, and like they make a very strong effort to learn as much as they can. But I think there's like a flip side to it. Like, yes, like there's some reference in that we appreciated what was done in the past and the history that we had learned from it, but we know that history has changed, and we just acknowledge that. But I think it's important that we learn about it. So I think it, like from a perspective of this is what has happened and we can't change it, I think we've moved on. But we try to learn as much as we can about our past, and my relatives always remind me of doing that. So that's my limited perspective.
Say we're in a kind of extraordinary period now of racial reckoning, and there's a lot to be reckoned with what happened in Hawaii, particularly after the annexation and the way in which culture was suppressed, and Native, Native Hawaiians, as Sarah, you know, and John, you probably know, were not permitted to speak their language, and there was no political organizing. So anyways, I think there'll be further historical examination of that period of time from the late 19th century through the period of statehood. And it has not been the kind of reckoning that we're seeing now happening with the African American experience yet in Hawaii. Maybe there won't be, but I think there should be.